IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory, was set up during the pandemic to synthesize evidence on all sorts of topics, from education to mental health, to topics like misinformation, which we are launching a report on very shortly. So we're calling this study Navigating the Crisis, and it is really about how governments thought their way through the turbulence, the uncertainties of, in many ways, an unprecedented global crisis, which had many dimensions, not just health, but also economic, social, educational, and so on. And we've tried to both describe some of the many methods used around the world, but also to make some judgments and some recommendations about what governments could take from the crisis and perhaps do things differently in the future. These are the authors: me, Oliver Marsh, and Anina Hengeler, who you see there and are also on the call if you have any comments to them. And I'd like to thank them for all the hard work put into this. I'd also like to thank the many people we spoke to in, I think, over 30, probably 35 countries around the world, many of whom were generous with their time and often were in quite sensitive positions in the hearts of government, so we couldn't actually quote them directly, but they were generous in sharing their observations on what had happened, what had worked, and also what hadn't worked, which is perhaps where it got sensitive. So the challenge, in a way, we were trying to address was how governments handled the extraordinary range of decisions they had to make under great pressure from early 2020 onwards. Decisions about who to test, about when to lock down, where and how to enforce mask wearing, when to close the schools or open the schools, whether to allow people in care homes to have visitors, how to implement vaccination rollouts, and all the very subtle decisions about shifting lockdowns, decisions which China is really grappling with great difficulty at the moment. This is a crisis which certainly isn't over in global terms. And we're looking at this as a question of thinking. How did governments think their way through these difficult, multidimensional questions? And we've tried to approach this with a sort of metaphor, a slightly loose metaphor of government and governance as a brain, as a thinking system, as cognition. And we're looking at the top there, in the pink bubbles, the inputs, the things which feed into thought, the raw data, observations, the models which try to make sense of that data, the evidence about what has or hasn't worked in the past, the tacit knowledge from frontline staff, nurses, police, and others, foresight to try and think ahead, and then creativity and innovation to solve problems. Those roughly are the inputs to intelligence, which then feed through various mediating systems and structures, the sort of pale yellowy pink circles, and then go into the decision-making of government executive agencies, ministries, local government, law enforcement, regulation, though of course also business, society, families, communities, and so on. We start off with data, and in many ways, it's an extraordinary story what happened worldwide in the orchestration of data, with many countries, particularly in East Asia, using very sophisticated means to bring together mobile phone data, credit card data, as well as data generated by local government to see who was infected, who they'd been in contact with. On the left there, you see a dashboard from Seoul in Korea, top right, Singapore's track and trace system, and bottom right, Taiwan's digital fence, which was an extraordinary, rather successful way of doing lockdowns at the level of individual homes rather than whole cities or provinces or nations, which much of the rest of the world did. And there was a lot of innovation in uses of data, sometimes slightly stretching the legal parameters, and sometimes not. And we also look at some of the more surprising innovations, like in the UK, Zoe, which gathered symptoms data from, in the end, 4 million people, which in some respects got a different and complementary picture to that coming through the official health service, which was particularly useful as new variants came into being, which had different symptoms patterns than the original ones. There was mass serological testing in some countries. In India, for example, the testing done by an NGO showed at various points that infection rates in slums of Mumbai and Delhi were already at 60 or 70%, and in schools at 80%, as the government was considering shutting the schools down to stop kids getting infected, and it turned out they'd already had the virus. So these were, again, useful ways of complementing government data to see the reality of the situation. And then there was testing of sewage, which the ONS in the UK began pretty quickly after the pandemic. And I think several thousand sites are now regularly testing sewage as a way of getting a different handle on infection rates. And these are just part of a much bigger story of creative innovation around data. We then look at models, and this has been an extraordinary period of visibility of models. Models like this one on the left, shown on the evening news, justifying often draconian measures by governments to stop the epidemic spreading out of control, to stop hospitals being overrun. And there's probably never been a time when so many of the public have had to engage with understanding models and their strengths and weaknesses. And we look at some of the very sophisticated models. This is the UK Joint Biosecurity Centre's ensemble of models, which they used. We look at the strengths and weaknesses of very simple models versus complex ones. The more complex ones aren't always better than the simple ones. And we show the imbalances in that, although there was a huge triumph in some respects of epidemiological models, there was very little use of modeling for things like mental health or the effects of school lockdowns on children. So there was an imbalance in the perspective which came through the models. We look at evidence, again, huge orchestration of evidence worldwide, and indeed last year, over 8% of all global research was pandemic related. Big arguments, of course, across the world on things like the evidence around face masks and transmission in the air. And evidence is a large part of IPPO's work, doing studies such as the one we did last year on lessons from the world's massive experiment in moving education online, and lots of quite surprising lessons of what worked, what didn't, and perhaps what might be done differently in the future as a result. Some of which has been taken on board by school systems, though most have just gone back to doing what they were doing anyway. We look at tacit knowledge, which became very important in our interviews. It was stressed by many people from the very global institutions to the very local ones that often the most important knowledge was shared informally between networks of experts who trusted each other, as well as through formal channels, and that sometimes a sense of what was happening on the ground was as important as the formal information, the formal data, the formal evidence. And so we look at different models of orchestrating tacit knowledge in either the sort of steep pyramid at the top or flatter ones. And we think this will be a very important theme of future crises, better semi-automated means of spotting patterns of experience which may not be captured in traditional data models. And then everywhere had to have some kind of foresight function, some way of thinking a few steps ahead, in particular, how to exit the crisis. Would the exit happen through vaccination or herd immunity or some combination of different approaches? And we look at a number of governments which set up separate teams to be, in a way, freed from the pressures of the very everyday crisis to look at what the options were 6, 12 months ahead. Some governments already had strong foresight functions, but they were usually looking 5 or 10 years ahead, and this required quite a shift of methods to look at the medium term. But without that, you risk being a prisoner of the immediate pressures of the crisis. And there was, of course, also extraordinary accelerated innovation through the pandemic, with governments playing a very direct role. The very visible examples, of course, were the vaccine developments all over the world, an extraordinary story of global cooperation, enormous amounts of money put in by governments, both to the R&D side and the pre-procurement side, and building on years of funding of mRNA and other underlying technologies. And in some ways, this story of relatively directed innovation is one which may have application in other fields. But there are also some very almost lighter touch, much cheaper models of innovation, such as the one you see on the right there from Estonia, Hack the Crisis. Germany had Vir versus Virus. Many governments tried to mobilize mass creativity on things like design of PPE or other ways of handling the problems of the crisis. And these may be pointers to very different ways of governments mobilizing collective intelligence in the future to help solve problems alongside the more traditional sort of industrial policy technology directing work around the vaccine itself. And we have a whole section in the report on all the different dimensions of communication, how communication came into governments, within governments, between different tiers, and out, of course, to the public. This picture comes from Taiwan, which had in many ways a very successful pandemic. They did very well and were very creative in many of the things they did. And this is just one example where they used humor to combat misinformation in a very rapid, agile way, was making fun of the people who were spreading false information about vaccines and so on, and appears to have been very successful, whereas most of perhaps Western Europe and North America's communication was much more traditional, press conferences, TV, etc., in a very sort of straightforward language. Taiwan is an interesting example of trying to almost get into the culture, the spirit of modern social media, of the TikTok and so on, in order to combat potentially damaging messages. Now, quite a lot of our interest then is in synthesis. So there are lots and lots of different inputs coming into governments. How did they make sense of them? How did they use these for action? And one tool of synthesis was dashboards, and there was a great experiment and explosion of different kinds of dashboards, a few of which you can see there. And in the report, we show these from Germany, UK, and Korea. And in a way, they open up the question, how should a government make complex phenomena accessible to a mass audience? What kind of dashboards work well? How do you simplify enough, but not too much? Most of these dashboards only covered physical health aspects of the crisis, though some, like the Korean one, included much more economic data. And we were beginning to see dashboards reach out into questions of mental health and anxiety. And I suspected there was another pandemic that might be one of the things to be included. So these are at least a crude method, both externally, but also within governments in communicating to cabinets and so on. You need some kind of dashboard. There were a lot of experiments in more integrated systems. One of the best we saw was in Bangladesh, which right from the start created what they called a collective data intelligence system, trying to pull together lots and lots of different data sources, not just on the health aspects, but also the economic aspects, and some very sophisticated measures around poverty and the use of AI to target financial support to the areas of greatest need. And I think many other countries could probably learn quite a bit from what Bangladesh did very effectively, often, but with rather fewer resources than the Germany's, US's, and so on. Some countries opted for highly centralized command as the way to do synthesis. This is a picture from Portugal, where the Prime Minister appointed an admiral to take almost a military charge of the pandemic and of vaccination in particular, rather successfully. Portugal was seen to have done well, and I think it achieved the highest vaccination rate of any country in Europe, partly under this highly centralized and focused approach. We look, though, at the challenge which I think any government has of synthesis, which is that there are many, many kinds of knowledge which are relevant to making a decision about something like ending a lockdown. I won't go through all of these, but the key point is these kinds of knowledge, from statistics to science to professional, practitioner, political, legal, implementation, ethical, and so on, all are relevant. They each often have their own profession, their own norms, their own ways of thinking. But in order to make a government decision, you need to often draw on all of them. And in different phases of a crisis, different ones will be paramount. And we thought governments lacked actually a very good sort of theory of synthesis of how to do this well, how to know which kinds of knowledge to use at different points, and how to train up and design the structures which are able to pull in all the different kinds of knowledge which may be relevant for difficult decisions. And this is, I think, potentially a topic for future attention as well, because it's also relevant to things like climate change and net zero. We use a couple of times in the report the metaphor of driving. You're driving through a storm, there's lightning, the roads are covered with water, you don't know if you're going to get to your destination. And we thought this was actually quite a good parallel for the challenges of being a government. And all of the categories we've looked at are pretty much the same ones you would face if you were that driver. You need your observational data on what's happening to the rain, how other cars are driving, are you going to run out of fuel? You implicitly or explicitly will be drawing on some evidence about how your car works and behaviors in weather. You have implicit models in your head, and some actually now programmed into your car, about things like braking distance, and your car indeed may now brake automatically for you. You will have tacit knowledge from your years of driving, which tells you how to steer or how to respond in unusual circumstances. You have foresight, hopefully. You need to think, a step ahead, and you may need creativity if there's an accident or the trees come down. So this metaphor, in a way, gives an architecture to how any government should think about anything, and ask itself whether it has the right data, evidence, models, tacit knowledge, etc., and whether they are being brought together in a coherent and competent way to help guide decisions. And in a sense, that's the key, I guess, I hope we think can happen from this report, is drawing on that to reflect on how government might be designed better, either for future pandemics or for slow burn crises. We point out perhaps the obvious thing, which is that the next crisis probably won't be like the last one. There'll be a real temptation everywhere in the world in 23 to plan better for the COVID-19 crisis. That's the natural human response, but it's not quite right, because the next crises will be different, and they need agility and flexibility, not overly rigid prediction. We argue for central roles in governments which are better at organizing the kind of intelligence we've been studying, and bridging both the functional silos, the divisions between statistics, data, science, and so on, and the departmental silos, health, education, and so on, which were probably a necessary feature of mid-20th century government, but less needed now given the tools we have available. It's obviously vital that the people making decisions are prepared, think through what a crisis might be like, and simulations still are probably the best way to do that. And a crucial finding, I think, of our research was about trust, and in particular, the need for relationships of trust between different parts of government and different tiers of government, so that people can contact someone and talk to them safely and opening up their vulnerabilities. And that's very difficult to do if people haven't got to know each other beforehand. And we saw striking differences between countries where that is deliberately cultivated and those where those relationships are much weaker. That includes the UK, I should say. And finally, we talk about norms of open and shared intelligence. This is the kind of summary diagram of, you know, how we're thinking about government thinking, drawing on all these different inputs with various intermediating structures to help with synthesis, which in turn leads to decisions, and then, of course, a loop back out to all of those inputs to contribute to learning. So I hope that gives you a sort of a flavor of what the report contains. We're now going to hear some comments initially on a video from Dame Juliet Gerrard from New Zealand, the Chief Scientific Advisor there.
Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the launch of this important report. I was lucky enough to be able to read a preview copy at the weekend and would like to congratulate the authors on providing a window into the behind-the-scenes responses of many countries and using that to inform an analysis of what was needed for success. The virus is still with us, and yet the teams put together to respond in the early phases of the pandemic are already being disbanded. So the publication of the report is particularly timely. Here in New Zealand, as Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, I had a front row seat in the early stages of the COVID response. Reflecting on that response, 3 characteristics stand out for me. First of all, New Zealand was fortunate to have a little time at the very beginning of the pandemic, as the virus did not arrive on our shores. We were particularly lucky that the city of Wuhan locked down, as several of our universities were expecting cohorts of students from Wuhan around that time, which may have given us a very different pandemic trajectory. We used our luck well and bought more time by closing the border. This provided a window to study data from other countries with different policy responses and dramatically different outcomes. Comparing, say, Taiwan and Italy provided compelling data to support early modelling, suggesting early lockdown was an effective initial response as we bolstered our health system. Secondly, we knew we weren't ready. We had a pandemic plan loosely based on influenza, but we did not rank well in pandemic preparedness, and our health system, especially our contact tracing systems, etc., were not yet up to the standard we would need to contain the virus. This made the choice of an elimination strategy easier to make. Thirdly, New Zealand is a small country, free from some of the more hierarchical structures seen elsewhere. This informality allowed people to step outside their normal roles and scramble to produce a policy response across normally siloed roles and structures. New Zealand had a variety of technical experts feeding into different parts of the government, with the composition evolving with time, enabling shifting expertise to contribute as the need arose. Modelling was especially important in the early days. Genomics became vital as sequencing underpinned our early contact tracing strategy, and later wastewater research and analysis became crucial, and so on. Cooperation within and across these technical experts and government teams depended critically on good personal relationships. Thus, I was very interested to see in the report the emphasis on these soft skills, on relationships, on tacit knowledge, on lived experience and communication, coming through as vital ingredients for success. I think in many ways these are easier in a small country, and they provided some mitigation against the natural tendency for information to be siloed and government structures to be fragmented. Congratulations again on a piece of analysis which I hope builds a foundation for deeper research of how intelligence underpins successful pandemic responses. I'm very happy to connect with anybody interested in more details of the New Zealand response. Thank you.
Well, thank you. In absentia, it's about 3 a.m. in New Zealand, so that's where Juliet is in a video form, not in person. And thanks too to our partners, INCSA, who are based at Auckland University, who helped on all the other parts of IPPO in the last couple of years. We're now going to turn to, well, first of all, to the UK to hear from Ed Humpherson, who is in charge of overseeing all of our statistics. So Ed, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Yeah, I'm head of the Office for Statistics Regulation, which is the regulatory office in the UK's statistical system, independent of central government. So we're an arm's length body. We often pitch ourselves as a regulatory body against the view that statistics are for elite decision makers. And for that reason, I really love this report. I love the breadth of it. I love the way it draws such an incredibly eclectic range of examples from across the world. I do really admire the emphasis on synthesis, but above all, there are parts of the report which had me, punching the air, because it brought out this idea that all of this data which is gathered, all of this evidence which is gathered, all of these different forms of knowledge that Geoff has described in the report gives an account for, shouldn't just be thought of being sucked up to some supreme centralized decision maker, but should also be made available transparently, openly, for the use of the public. And that's the essence of our work as a statistics regulator. If I look at the pandemic in the UK and particularly think about data, about statistics, I see three significant barriers coming down as a result of the pandemic experience. The first barrier is the barrier to data sharing and linking. It's been a long-standing problem in UK public administration that data are held in silos, not linked and shared, and the pandemic went some way to breaking down that barrier. Things like the COVID data store, or even simple things like analyzing the ethnicity, mortality by ethnicity, relied on some reasonably elaborate data linking. The report that Geoff and colleagues have produced shows this is still an issue, particularly between different tiers of government, but there's definitely progress there. Second barrier that's come down is I think the notion of what statistical evidence can be published, a willingness to publish earlier data, faster data, drawing on much more data sources that are not directly collected, using, for example, credit card data provided by credit card companies to get a sense on economic transactions, mobility data, how people are moving around. Those are new things. They people became comfortable with publishing them, and I think that really helped inform the public very well. And the third kind of sort of barrier which came down is the point where I started, which is this growing notion that what is good for decision makers is also good for the public. So you had a sort of a collapse of a barrier between saying we're going to collect this stuff internally, and when we're ready, we'll let a little bit of it out. Actually, lots of stuff, scientific advice, data, statistics was made available rapidly. I think that did create some problems of what you might call context collapse, things being taken out of their scientific or their statistical context and being used for misinformation. But above all, I think this was an incredibly powerful way of enrolling and democratizing the society in the whole pandemic effort. So I think the report brings these themes out beautifully. For me, the emphasis on synthesis is also really excellent, and it fits with everything I've been saying, because of course, in the world of statistics, you sometimes get the sense that what statisticians want to do is to provide the answer through their analysis, and fail to realize that all of these other forms of evidence are also available and influencing how a decision maker thinks. And I think the report makes a very telling contribution on this emphasis on synthesis. So I really love the report. It resonates with what I saw, and I'd love to hear what people think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ed, for those kind comments. And I hope we will, take this all further. Our next speaker is Paula Daza from the other end of the world. We've been to New Zealand, so now to Chile. Paula played an absolutely central role through the pandemic in Chile, in the government, and is now now an academic, and I'd like to thank you for coming again. She gave a fantastic talk a couple of weeks ago to our graduate students from all over the world who learn how to run government, and she shared her insights then. So Paula, over to you, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, really much, for inviting me to participate in this excellent seminar. It has been a very important for us to be here today. Yes, I was in the part of the government the last 4 years, and now I'm in the executive director of a Center of Health Public Policies in University of Desarrollo. I just want to review some things that we had and some thoughts what we have done during the last 4 years. In Chile, when the pandemic arrived in our country, we were in a moment of very social turbulence, where there was a lot of distrust in us, authorities. The pandemic came and it caught us really off the guard. We needed to develop many platforms, technological platforms, in order to register all the information, and rapidly we have to manage this. Rapidly, scientists started to search for information. However, we knew it was not, from the very beginning, we knew that this was not just a scientific problem, it was also a political, social, and economic problem, as in the whole world. But in Chile, from the very, very beginning, the pandemic was a state problem. Our president in those moments was President Sebastián Piñera. He ordered all the ministry had to face the pandemic in a coordinated manner led by the Ministry of Health, where I was. This meant that the Treasury Department, the Ministry of Defense, every department of the government have to make itself available to face the pandemic, transport vaccines, and all what we needed. These political decisions were always based on scientific evidence. We need to develop technology platforms. We didn't have technology platforms in order to register all the information necessary to design the responses. We use real-time frequencies and Bayesian approaches for data analysis. We developed tools to allocate testing, guiding, isolation measures, and estimating hospitalizations needed and vaccine effectiveness. One of the positive things that we have in Chile, that everyone who is vaccinated has a registration number and is registered in the same platform. So we could see what was happening with them. In these times of uncertainty, trust, I think, was the main element to move forward. We're very aware that without trust, it was very difficult to manage the COVID-19. So providing us with scientific evidence to support our decisions was crucial for increasing public trust, although communicating every day the evidence also has many problems. We knew that we could not do it alone, so we made alliances with universities, the private sector, in order to challenge together the coordinated manner. Even though our decisions were based on scientific evidence, we went through very, very difficult political moments. Every political analyst in the television, in the radio, everywhere had an opinion on how to manage the pandemic. There was a lot of epidemiologists all over the country. Many saw, yes, as an opportunity those days to weaken the president. And one of the examples that also I showed in the class last weeks, that was that when in 2021, we were in quarantine for a long time. People were in the homes. We knew that people were very, very tired of being quarantined. But also we saw that the vaccinated had less risk of getting risk. So we knew that if we gave more liberties for that would be okay. So we decided to give those who were vaccinated some bit of freedom. Those same days, the medical school in Chile has a lot of confidence among the people. And the same days that we announced this strategy of giving more freedom to the vaccinated, they announced a proposal that they named it Short Circuit, that was a zero COVID strategy. Everyone has to stay at home, all the transport have to be canceled. Although they sent those proposals, we confronted them, and we proposed, we communicate scientific evidence, and although we were very criticized, at last the people got confidence in our data, in our communication, and that was a good decision. Although we had to confront a group that had a lot of confidence in the population. Finally, I want to say that the main lesson of the pandemic as scientific evidence is very important. That is no doubt. However, when we have to develop public policies, it's essential to consider other aspects like political, social, communicate, transparency, and the most important is to have the trust of the community. We had many moments of hopeless because it seemed the pandemic would never end. Although it was difficult, I was a part of a group of our government that later was international recognized for the achievement during the pandemic. So that was difficult, but I think that trust was the main positive thing that we had. Thank you very much for listening to me, Geoff, and thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you very much, Paula. And this point about trust just comes out through everything, and it's trust within the system, trust between the tiers of the system, and trust with the public. And the last 2 weeks in China have been shown us how, in that context too, trust matters greatly, as well as within the democracies. So a long way from Chile, let's turn to Wales, to Rob Orford, Chief Scientific Advisor on Health to the Government of Wales. Please share with us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you kindly for the invite. So Prabhandar from Wales, which is sunshiny like London today, so that's great. I'll try not to repeat some of the comments that my colleagues have made, but I agree with them entirely. So this is very positive. So during the pandemic, I was responsible for setting up a technical advisory cell and a multidisciplinary technical advisory group called TAG, which had 9 subgroups feeding to it. And we took the principle of the 3 Ps of publish, 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 and everything that we did, we shared, and they're available on the Welsh Government website. As in other countries and colleagues here, that was necessary to cope with the sheer volume and demand for information throughout the pandemic period. And within the UK, we're currently going through a public inquiry to learn the lessons, importantly, learn the lessons of the things that work well and the things that work less well. And that's an important process. During the pandemic, I had the immense benefit of being a member of SAGE as well, which is an absolute academic powerhouse across a number of areas. And I think in particular, thinking back to those early days, behavioural science really stood up and was really, really informative. Understanding the virus and the way in which it behaved in the environment and within people was very, very important, as well as policy modelling. I think from the get-go, they were the 3 most important. But then as things evolved, things like socio-economic harms, impact on children and education, environmental science, these came to the fore and helped us. So I'm very grateful to be part of this project. I think it's immensely important that we try and capture those memories and lessons and experiences before they fade away. And I think one of my colleagues said that, you know, as the tide decreases, then policy colleagues go to other areas of challenge. And I think, you know, it's difficult. I think it's in the report for government to face many different directions and face many different challenges, of which there are many. I really hope to use this report going forward. I'd really like to invite the report authors to come to my government, Welsh Government, and talk to my policy colleagues about their lessons and your lessons, and use that to inform our response. So we are taking learnings. We did the foresight reports. We did 3 of them each summer. It was a bit like an inverse of Santa's Grotto, where we wrote winter papers. We looked at the southern hemispheres and we said what might happen here. We looked at escapes from the pandemic into endemic, and it was all very very difficult. And it's difficult to do that slower thinking when you're fighting fires in front of you, but it's really important that we try and do that, otherwise you do get stuck. So we've tried to implement a sustainable way to keep that capability and capacity, to keep the policy modelling to hand, to keep the behavioural science to hand, but it's not straightforward to do that. And I think we really need to develop that, that need for open and transparent thinking that science brings you, and work at that interface with policy colleagues, and that interplay between science, which is difficult, it's abstruse, and policy, which is a bit of a dark art, and it's difficult from the outside to understand how it really works, and it's complex. And we need to do that in trusted partnerships, as you said, Geoff, locally, regionally, nationally, and importantly, internationally, before the next ones come. And throughout that period, I did look at international countries. We all looked at each other. It would be bonkers not to do that. And we asked, what were you doing and why were you doing it? And we often used open source media and publications to do that, but seldom did I have the opportunity to sit with you and say why and explore that together. And I think reports like this and others will really help us, but we need to put that energy and effort into this to work together in those trusted partnerships with people both close to us, with our organizations that we work with, and policy colleagues in different silos, but you're further away, and with countries that we may or may not have good political relationships with, but with science and scientific diplomacy, we should be able to cut through that to get right to the bones of the questions and use intelligence, logic, and reasoning to inform our policies that are amenable to science and intelligence. So thank you very much. It's an excellent report. My full commendations. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you for the very good questions we've got in the chat, which I hope our commentators might have a look at, because I would love to hear your responses to them. There's a question about really the cognitive distortions which happen in a pandemic, where you look at what's new or the dramatic numbers on the evening news, but maybe ignore some of the slower burn things in the UK context, like on mental health or care, the care home sector. So any comment on that would be good. There's a question about how to organize fast learning from the innovations, because obviously some of them won't work. One interesting example we looked a bit at was Switzerland, where each canton often pursued different policies and appeared to learn rather quickly from looking at each other. But we didn't come across very much system in many places for learning from multiple experiments. The US should do it, for example, but hardly did at all. And obviously the question of trust and its link to behavior of senior figures was a very big issue in UK politics, with various trips and parties and so on. But is there anything perhaps which could be done to prepare in the future for trust, to ensure that those sort of mistakes don't happen? So perhaps we might have some quick comments from each of you, Ed, Paula, and then Rob on, and whichever of those questions you would like to touch on. Ed, perhaps first.
I'll pick up on the trust point, because we spend a lot of our time thinking about trust in statistics, public confidence in statistics, and I think I can apply the same principles that we use for that very specific context to the broader notion of trust in sort of policy making. So what we're disciples of the philosopher Honora O'Neill, and we draw a very sharp distinction between trust, which is a belief on the part of a person, an observer, and trustworthiness, which is what an organization or an actor seeks to display. So we always encourage any producer, publisher of statistics to demonstrate their trustworthiness, and they do so by virtue of making a series of commitments, very transparent, tangible commitments that they are then very obvious. It's very obvious whether they keep them or not. Like we require them to always fix a date in advance and a time in advance when they'll publish their statistics, so that there's no risk of that publication being subject to sort of political kind of tactical maneuverings. And if they obviously breach that time, it's really obvious. And we have various other commitments that we require. Now, applying that notion of trustworthiness, which is you commit to do something which may be not in your short-run interests, and then you demonstrate that you've done it, that does build trustworthiness. I would say that the kinds of behaviors listed in the question might not be conducive to trustworthiness. I probably should not say much more than that because it starts to get rather political, but it seems to me that it's fairly obvious that if you make commitments and then are tangibly seen not to stick with them, that's probably not conducive to trustworthiness. So I'll leave it there, if I may, Geoff.
Thanks, Ed. Paula, over to you.
Yes, well, I would like to talk about one of the questions that you have there. We have some examples of how government made this balance between encouraging innovation while having adequate correcting mechanisms. As I told you in my presentation, when the pandemic hit in Chile, we were in a very social problem. People didn't have trust in the authorities. So we rapidly had to make some alliances with our other actors that had a lot of confidence. And we made alliances with almost many universities. And in relation to that, with the alliances, there was a lot of innovation, a lot of problems that they have to take. And I want to give you one example. From the very beginning, we made an alliance with a University of Chile. I gave them the questions, and one of the questions I gave them was, I'm testing, I'm doing a lot of tests around Chile. We just didn't test the people who were with symptoms, but also we were searching for those who had no symptoms. So we were going out to the streets, but we have very low positive. We had 1% of positive. So we have to be more efficient with our resources. So I asked them if we have some form to be more efficient with our resources. So we made an alliances with a telephone company who can see how the people were moving. So the alliance with the private sector, they see where the positive cases were. We have as a government, we have the positive cases, and the university through an intelligence mechanism, they could say, well, the positive cases are in that. So though they develop, we call it warm maps. So we could go there and search for the cases. That was a very innovative. And for that, we could go up with the cases from 1%, we went up to 3-4% in some places where we could search the cases. So I think this alliances with the university was really very important in us as a public policy.
Thank you, Paula. Rob.
Thanks. If I can pick up on David's question around cognitive biases, I think it's really important that we gave that quite a bit of thought during the pandemic. There were no harm-free options. The tools that we had available prior to vaccines were blunt. They caused harm as well as avoided or reduced harm. In Welsh Government, we used the 5 harms framework often. So this was direct harm, so harms arising from COVID itself, indirect harms, which would be things like displaced care because of COVID, economic harms arising from people who are ill from COVID or from the protections, harms arising from the protections themselves, like mental health harm, domestic abuse, suicide, and then lastly, inequalities, whether they were new inequalities or new inequalities that have been introduced during the pandemic. So when we thought about protections, when we thought about measures and policies, we tried to describe them in terms of that 5 harms framework. Throughout the pandemic, different times we looked at things like deaths, excess mortality compared against different deaths. Over time, we've done that 3 or 4 different times. We've looked at things like social costs of a case. We've looked at case incidents and protections over time and trying to bring that together on a paper on the impact of protections against those 5 different harms. And I think, only time will tell, in a few generations, that age-adjusted mortality over that period compared to different conditions, how well we did or didn't do. But it's important that we keep learning those lessons. just briefly on cognitive biases, there's an excellent BBC Sounds documentary by Steven Pinker called Think with Pinker that explores each of them, and I would point colleagues towards that. It's very edifying. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to ask if Oliver and Anina would like to share anything you think we haven't said, which should be pointed out. And in response to Nick's question, definitely this issue of transparency. In a way, the whole ethos we've tried to get through the report is this idea of intelligence moving from something hoarded in the centers of government to something shared with openness and transparency about the processes of how data is collected, etc. Oliver, Anina, anything you would like to throw in as co-authors?
Yeah, I've got one point to add, Geoff. So just on the question around innovation and Paula's comments around, sort of extending on Paula's comments around the importance of academic and private partnerships in the pandemic response. I think one thing that came through very clearly was just how important those were. So how much knowledge and intelligence was able to be developed and organized from those or collected from those partnerships was a very big point. I think there's also something equally important around government capability. So the ability for officials within government to be able to assess what is a good opportunity, what is feasible and workable to actually lead to the kinds of intelligence and knowledge that government needs to make decisions. So I think in the UK and in many countries, there was, a lot of snake oil being sold essentially to governments in terms of modeling, in terms of data sources that created a lot of time wastage, which is very, very important in a pandemic response when time is everything. So I think that's a really big point. So having enough staff, not technical experts with PhDs in epidemiology, on call all the time, not on call in-house, but really just to be able to have enough knowledge to assess what is needed and what is reasonable. I think that would be my only point.
Thanks, Anina. Oliver, anything for you?
Yes, thank you. I think there's an interesting role for what we might call positive surprises. Obviously, COVID had a lot of negative surprises, but one of the things we've seen is, as well as creativity that was directed and innovation that was encouraged, there's also the success of schemes which were surprisingly capable of flexing to new environments. So David's question around cognitive biases, some of those interviewees who worked on teams that were involved in foresight, as we talked about, and forward planning, even if they sometimes struggled to get decision makers to listen to 6 to 12 month foresight reports because they were too busy thinking about the next day and the next week, what training teams to think in a foresight driven way did, and also to use open source intelligence, was that you had teams that were already trained in capabilities such as avoiding cognitive biases, assessing the reliability of evidence in the round within government, although they had never been hired or trained or set up to do kind of open source scanning of COVID evidence reports or international monitoring of reports coming out of other countries. It turned out they were quite good at that and were able to be a kind of useful ad hoc consulting board for governments, even if those governments weren't listening to the foresight reports that these teams might have wanted them to. Their skills were still pivotable to another context. And there are other examples of that in the report. So it's those capabilities to move something to a beneficial new context, even if you'd never planned for it to exist in those contexts, which is actually a very valuable part of a government response as well, as long as it's not, that capability is not restricted from moving or pivoting or flexing to a new environment.
Thanks, Oliver. In a way, that's a key message of the report, is that kind of agile synthetic capability is key. It doesn't have a formal home often in governments, and indeed it doesn't have a formal home in universities, which still divide everything down by different functions like data or futures or evidence or statistics. And yet in practice, you have to bring those together. And so one of the things I hope this report in a small way advocates is both different structures in government, but perhaps in universities too, for the study of how intelligence is organized in practice. In a way, this is quite sort of boring stuff. It's the plumbing, which is sort of behind the scenes in government, but very important to effectiveness. And just one final comment on care. About a year ago, we actually did quite a bit of work in IPPO on how you would apply similar principles to the care system, which at least in the UK was far, far behind the hospitals in terms of data, models, orchestration of tacit knowledge, evidence, all the things we've described. But in the end, the department, we didn't really, there wasn't a demand for that. But I hope in the future, some of these approaches may be applied to fields like care, which relatively lack them. And finally, since we've got 1 minute left, I will say in the last chapter, we do comment that the pandemic isn't over, and it's still not quite clear what the final judgment will be about which countries have done well or badly. So there will be a need for more research in future on the link between intelligence methods and actual outcomes achieved. Because the patterns have been still somewhat fluid in terms of relative national performance. So on that note, can I thank all of you for coming? Thank our speakers for joining us. This session will be obviously available online, and one of our tasks in the next few months will be to share some of this in different audiences and hopefully turn some of the recommendations into action. Many thanks to all of you, and have a lovely sunny day.